Everyone thinks they need motivation, which they don't. They need better systems. If your life is chaotic, it's not because you're lazy, it's because your environment sucks. A couple years back when I was trying to wake up at 5 a.m., I failed for months until I changed 3 things in my environment that I'll discuss more as we dive into this key component. I didn't get more discipline, I got smarter. Now, before I get into speaking about the second most important part in the rebuilding blueprint, I'd like to say welcome back to part 2. If you haven't seen part 1, I recommend watching part 1 before this one in order to get an understanding on how each role plays a part in our lives. But without further ado, today we'll be diving into the second key component, which I like to call the outer structure. The outer structure is the thing you control outside yourself that shapes the habit that shapes you. Now, there are 3 areas that I found that in order for the outer structure to have an effect, it must be aligned. First one to start us off. Discipline starts with environment. Let's get this out of the way. Willpower is a limited resource. You wake up with a full tank and around 6 p.m. you're running on fumes. Trying to rely on willpower all day is like driving a car that has only half a tank. Eventually you're gonna stall out. But your environment that runs 24/7, it doesn't get tired, it doesn't forget, it just works. For you or against you. So the game isn't about becoming this hyper-disciplined robotic version of yourself. The game is, how do I design my surrounding so that I don't need to be sitting all the time? Here's an example. If your social circle is like draining you, here's the hard truth. You don't need to cut everyone off, but you do need to curate your energy. You're allowed to spend time with people who are pulling you away from who you're trying to become. This isn't about being antisocial. It's about being intentional. Your environment includes people, and not everyone deserves a front row seat in your life. Now, the second one, create friction for bad habits and flow for good ones. So something I've been realizing lately, and honestly, it sounds super obvious when I say it kind of out loud, is this idea. Make the bad habit harder, make the good ones easier. That's it. That's kind of like the whole strategy. But here's what's wild. Most of us, myself included, do the exact opposite. An example would be junk food. We keep junk food in the pantry just in case, we make it super easier to binge our favorite TV shows. But somehow working out sometimes feels like this massive task that feels like climbing a mountain. I've been able to flip that for the last couple of years and consistently not fall for this. An example would be, I've been trying to get back into my morning workouts, and layering out my clothes the night before is one of those things that actually make a difference. It sounds kind of dumb, but when my brain is still foggy at like 5 a.m., just seeing the clothes laid out kind of removes one excuse. And here the biggest kind of idea hit me. Habits are just behavior on autopilot. You don't even realize you're doing half the stuff you're doing until you zoom out. And once you realize that, the question becomes, are you building your autopilot for success or for regrets? I've been asking myself that a lot lately, and if you're in the same boat, maybe that's the place to start. Look at where your life is running on default and ask, is this making my life easier or harder? And then, start to tweak the default. Now, third one would be to rewire your reward system. Here's a hard one to hear, but it's true for all of us. You're addicted to quick dopamine. We all are. Social media, food delivery, that little notification buzz. It's a hit of reward with zero effort, and it's messing with your brain's ability to feel satisfied doing hard things, which is a problem because all the good stuff in life, it comes from effort. So what do? We rewire the reward system. We start teaching our brains to love the process and not just the prize, which when I heard this, it made so much sense. And it blew my mind because I've always looked at it through that lens, and that process kept me moving forward, but at a slow rate, and not the rate I knew, myself could handle. Here are kind of like a few practical ways to kind of do that. One will always be to track your progress. Even if it's small wins, cross it off the list. Use something like a habit tracker. That check gives your brain that dopamine, which, hits in a healthy way. Another one will be to reflect regularly at the end of your weeks, look back and ask, what did I do this week that made me proud, even if no one else noticed? To me, that's how you train delayed gratification. That's how you build real, lasting discipline. You start rewarding yourself for being consistent and not just winning. So yeah, that's kind of what I've been learning. It's not really about willpower. It's about setting yourself up to win before you even need willpower. Your environment, your systems, your habit, this outer structure, it's either making the path easier or it's making everything harder than it needs to be. And when I started shifting those outer things, even just a little, it changed how I saw myself. I wasn't lazy, wasn't undisciplined. I just had a setup that made failure way too convenient. So if any part of this episode hit home, here's a challenge I'll leave you with. Pick one, just one thing in your environment that's been making life harder, and change it. Add friction to that bad habit, add flow to a good one. That 1% shift, that's the beginning. That's how momentum starts. And if this helped you or made you think differently about your habits and discipline, please share it with someone who's in the same boat, because we all need these reminders. Now, before I wrap this episode up completely, part 3 is coming next. And I really want you to tune in to hear the third key, because it's the final piece. We talked about the internal stuff, the external stuff, but in part 3, I'm diving into what I think is the most powerful part of this whole process, which you'll have to tune in to know. This is the stuff that most people skip, the invisible thing that controls how consistent you actually are. So if you ever ask yourself, why do I keep falling off even when my routine is perfect? Or why don't I believe I can actually stick to this? That episode is for you. It's the finale and it ties everything together. So stay tuned, subscribe if you haven't already, and let's keep building this thing together. I appreciate you for being here. I'll see you in part 3.